So, a quick introduction to the project that we've been working on for the past few weeks. We've been working with Community Association Title, otherwise known as CAT. And a lot of the problems that they had with the legacy system, it had poor usability due to its design. So, in order to address that, we redesigned the website and we added some additional functionalities to help with users with the usability of the website. And a large portion of the code was migrated to another platform. And this was to support the functionalities that we implemented.
Yeah, and so in modernizing their legacy system, we decided to go with a modern SaaS application with a modern web stack, including Node.js and Express for the backend and AngularJS for our front end framework, as well as implementing a MySQL database. Their old one was very outdated. And so part of the changes that we also included was that changing their whole database system, instead of using these couple main databases that they had linked together, instead using one relational database distributed into multiple tables with a main table and several supporting tables. We also created a new user login system that was more of a tiered access to prevent unwanted record addition, deletion, and just to really improve user management. And so starting out, you have the base user, which is read-only. They can log into the site and they can only read the forms that have been stored in the database, not modify or add to them. Next up is the standard user, which adds on the writing and creation permissions. And lastly, you have the super user or the admin. They have the same functionality as before, but they can also create new users, whether they're admins, read-only, or just normal users. In addition to this, we also implemented some tools using Mocha.js and Cucumber.js to ensure sufficient test coverage for our website to make sure that the modifications that we are making were going to be correct, and using proper TDD and BDD development techniques.
Yeah, so as Nathan kind of spoke about before, CAT's old database management system was a nightmare. As you can see in the images down below, you can see just how dated their system is, as well as the relations that they have between what are these so-called tables. Their original database management system was over 25 years old, and it is in desperate need of an overhaul. So the basis of it is it's a basic database management system. You were able to log in, and then you were able to view, add, and delete records, and anybody could delete those records. They had several of these interlinking quote-unquote databases, which we'll cover a little bit later, and that was the purpose of it, was just to access information related to them. As I said before, any authenticated user is able to delete records. For no reason whatsoever, records would get dropped. They were never able to, in the 25 years of it being operated, figure out why this was happening. There were no acidity properties for the database itself. And the last two things of notable issues were that the application is difficult to understand in general, as you can see in that left-hand image down below. And likewise, if you're using a scroll wheel or a trackpad's scroll functionality and you accidentally scroll with it, it will take you to a random record of an existing record, and it will also drop your existing changes that you made to the current record you were originally on.
So our client is the company Community Association Title, also known as CAT, and the person that we've been in contact with is Brian Goodwin, who is the Information Technology Manager at CAT.
So in terms of the features implemented, we parallelly developed new stories along with transitioning the front-end framework from Semantics UI to Angular. With respect to the user stories, a majority of the time was spent on developing the three forms that the website has: MAL, MML, and MCD. For MAL, the create form was already developed, so we had to transition that to Angular and implement the update MAL functionality. For MML, we implemented the front end and back end for the create MML form. However, for MCD, we implemented the back end routes only. A user with an admin access is able to create and update these forms, but a user with read-only access can only access a particular entry but not modify it.
So we encountered several issues while developing this application, and that's to put it lightly, but we were able to surmount the majority of these issues. And so some of the issues we encountered were, first of all, transitioning to Angular from a base HTML, CSS, JavaScript platform. So having Angular means that you have a separate server running your front end and a separate server running your back end. The purpose of this being partitioning your client and server side operations. And so quite a bit of time was spent researching how to properly integrate these new servers and actually have them running cooperatively. Likewise, porting this application to Heroku was also a nightmare. We ran into several issues, which took an incredible amount of time to fix, and we actually ended up having to contact some of the developers at Angular and some of the people who are more well-versed than we are with it to get some help on the Angular's official Discord server. So some of those issues were that Express and Angular both utilize something called a package.json file, which is used to compile and run the server itself. And so having two conflicting package.json files in the root directory caused them to conflict with the naming confliction, and basically we weren't able to run them until we extracted the entirety of the front end code base to a separate file. Likewise, Heroku runs on Linux, and Linux recognizes case sensitivity, whereas when some of our developers were using Mac is insensitive to case naming. Therefore, Heroku was unable to see several of our file names due to this. And finally, this was a very large project. So the MAL, MCD, and MML, each of those different quote-unquote databases utilize over anywhere between 100 to 200 data endpoint fields and data entry fields. This was just a very large amount of data to manage and to accept and modify.
So what we learned from this project is to have everyone be familiar with the development environment before we began working on user stories. Our project required us to install tools such as MySQL Workbench and to set up the databases for it. And having everyone familiar with the development environment helped a lot in the beginning. We also learned to have everyone be as involved as possible for testing. We felt that we got little utility from the BDD and TDD tests due to a lack of collaboration when it came to testing. Also, we learned a lot about refactoring. We had a lot of redundant code in the program that could have been removed. So by refactoring, we managed to reduce redundancy by up to 50% in some files, and we eliminated over 2,000 lines of code across multiple forms.
Hello. This is Team 404, and we are working on the Community Association title database management system. My name is Brandon. I mostly worked on the backend and especially on our Heroku application, splicing it together.
Hi, my name is Andy, and I also worked on the back end. I created a lot of the tables and the routes, and also I worked on the TDD unit tests.
Hi, my name is Chris Lee. I worked on the front end, and I also did some of the testing.
Hi, my name is Nathan Bianco, and I also worked on the back end, doing a lot of work with the legacy code and refactoring it, and a lot of testing using Postman.
Hi, my name is Rashmeet Ladhar, and I worked on the front end. I mostly worked on the transition to Angular.
Hi, my name is Shai Fang, and I mostly work on the front end.
So today we're going to be giving you guys a little bit of an overview of our application, some of the problems that we ran into, especially with hosting on Heroku, and just a nice little overview of why we've been working to transition a very, very old legacy project into a new up-to-date software as a service model. So yeah, we're going to be hopping back and forth between a version of our application running locally so we can show off some of the features that properly work there, as well as our live site. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the sheer magnitude of the volume of data entry points we had to have to support the actual application, as this is a database management system. So Rajmeet, if you'll go ahead and click login. So one of the first problems that we ran into with our application is that we decided to transition our application from a static HTML, JavaScript, CSS front-end framework to one that's known as Angular. Angular supports basically a partitioning between front-end and back-end services through a separate front-end and back-end, or client and server product application, excuse me. And so basically, once we separated these two out, we started running into issues in terms of communicating between these two servers and basically sharing data between them. One of the other things that broke was our authentication solution. Before we ported our application to Angular, we were successfully able to authenticate users with a library called passport.js. We used a quote-unquote basic authentication solution where we had an email and password hashing combination where the password was hashed using bcrypt, and basically we used a cookie to authenticate our users via if if the cookie was existent and hadn't expired. Once we ported to Angular, however, Angular began generating what's known as a session every single time a new URL was accessed, breaking that cookie system that we had before. And so here, if you click login, you won't be able to, but on our local version, Rajmeet, if you'll do so, we will show you guys two different users where basically you're actually able to log in and you can actually access the forms that we have. So Rajmeet, if you'll go ahead and log back out, we'll show you guys that if you try to log in with a non-existing user, you won't be able to log in. Whereas on our current website, that wouldn't work. So if you type in, an improper password, you won't be able to log in. But if you type in the right password, if you do so again, Rajmeet, which is just 123, you're able to log in. So the next thing we're going to show you guys are the actual what are called databases. So these were terms affectionately referred to by employees of community association title. And these are very, very, very large data input fields. Each section is its own form. And we had to support not only one-to-one mappings with these tables, but also one-to-many. What this means is that for every database, there is one main record to house an entry, and then supporting tables that map or utilize foreign keys back to the primary record. So, for example, the primary association information is stored within the main record itself, but supplemental association information is stored within a foreign key table. And that goes the same for every single section here. So this is the local host on you'll actually, Rajmeet, if you'll go to the main website, you can see that we're able to access the same site, but we're not able to persist data through our database. These databases are supposedly hooked up to the same database. We're just not able to show that, unfortunately. And so if you go to dashboard, Rajmeet, you should be able to bypass that. Perfect. And so what we're looking here to do is just quickly show you guys that we're able to access the form. Excellent. Okay, so Rajmeet, if you'll go back to the localhost version, you can see that there are a ton of data entry points. If you scroll down, you can see so many. And that's not even all of them. So Rajmeet, if you'll go ahead and enter in some information that we'll use to show that we can persist data through our database, what we're going to be doing is creating a new entry within our database for the MAL. And that means creating about 13 separate creating 13 separate records that all utilize foreign keys back to this one specific record. And that's fine. So we'll go ahead and go back, create the entry, and you'll see that it changes the URL from mal/create to mal/entry with a specific identifier or index, which we use to access them. And so you can see that the new entry points that she's typed in are persistent with our new entry, and we're actually able to update them as well. And so if you want to go ahead and change a field or two, Rajmeet, to show that we're actually able to update it, we'll do that as well. And then if you can refresh the page to show that it actually works. Perfect. There it is. Okay. For a second, I thought it didn't work. But so you guys can see that option 1 and option 2 within status, within firm, and domicile city persist as their updates. And if you scroll down, you can see that we also support an additional several sections, which means additional entry points. The same goes for our MML and MCD pages. We're not going to show them due to time, but it's the same process. We have several different data entry sections with tons of different data entry fields. And that's why we ended up switching to Angular, is because Angular supports TypeScript, and we're able to quickly or more efficiently update this information. And the last thing we're going to show you guys is basically our UML diagrams. It really is hard to understand just how many data entry fields there are until we're able to kind of create a visual for that. And that's what UML diagrams are for. So this is the UML diagram for our MAL table. So the first thing I want to point out is our users table here indicates some additional information besides email, password, which is a hashed password of it with passport. It also includes first, middle, last name, and then some additional metrics in case of necessary password resetting or changing an email associated with your address. Here is the MAL base record. This is what we use for the primary key, which is its ID. So for example, we created an MAL entry for the number 34, and that's its identifier. That you can then see all of these separate tables that support the UML, or excuse me, that support the MAL. They're massive. And each one of these has several different input fields, and they all map back via a foreign key, which you can see down here called MAL related ID, which is an integer. It is whatever the ID of the parent record is. Next, I will show you guys the MML, excuse me. And again, it's a very large set of tables that relates back via foreign key. And again, the users table is shown up here for authentication purposes. And again, I will show you the MCD as our last one. And here that is down here. So there are several different, again, entry points that all have to relate back to one single record. And on the back end, that means querying all of these separate tables via the foreign key relation and pushing them to the front end in the body of the response. So that's about it. Thank you guys very much. I really do appreciate it. So one of the last things that we want to cover is basically, our actual website that's hosted on Heroku. While there's several features missing as opposed to what the application runs on a local host or locally, there are several things that are still there. So you're able to actually interact with the forms that are on both the MML and the MAL pages, and you're able to access the quote unquote the entry field. So once you enter in information, you create that form, and then that actually creates a new record in our backend database, and it actually takes you to that record itself and populates the information within our forms with the data that you've just entered. You unfortunately can't access that specific data, but you can access the forms for them. And so as you see before, or as you saw before, you're able to see that on our local versions where you're able to interact with the MAL and the MML. That the same thing goes for our live version. And so within the MAL, you can enter in this information. You can click the create button, and what will happen is it will take you to the, excuse me, I am unable to access that because I can't see it. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Okay, so if you enter in /entry and then /an integer, for example, with that integer corresponding to the record's ID, it will take you to that specific record associated with the ID, and you're able to enter in the specific information or just view it for whatever your administrative needs are. The final thing we wanted to talk to you all about was basically the issues that we ran into hosting our application on Heroku, as there were several. So basically, hosting an application on Heroku is usually tricky, as I've worked with it several times in the past, so I kind of headed up getting our application running on Heroku. And initially, it was fine. When we hosted one single application on one code base, there were no issues running it whatsoever. Our authentication solution worked, and our database interactions worked as well. But once we partitioned our front end and back end via client-server interactions, we started running into several issues. The first of which was that we had to add additional scripts to actually run both applications, not even access them, but just get both of the servers running. Likewise, we also needed to add, we actually had to change our file structures within the front end code base. Basically, what was happening is that Heroku runs on Linux, whereas several of our developers were operating on macOS. macOS is case insensitive. It doesn't matter if there's upper or lower case letters within a file name. It will recognize them the same. Whereas for Heroku, as it runs on Linux, it's case sensitive. Heroku wasn't identifying several of our files due to case sensitivity issues. Finally, the last issue we were running into is that both Express, which is a backend framework for Node.js, and Angular utilize something called a package.json file. Package.json files are used to compile and operate the different servers. So when there are conflicting package.json files, there's a naming collision, and you can't have two of the same file names in the same file structure. We had to extract the entirety of our front-end code base to a separate file, which led to several issues running both of the servers at the same time. The last issue that Heroku is currently encountering is that it's unable to access several of the remaining files for our backend, running into the issue of not being able to persist the data or access the database itself. We feel that it's probably due to a few more naming issues within Heroku's Linux versus Mac OS, or possibly a couple of other issues that we also ran into that we just don't have time to cover here. But again, thank you so much for your guys' time. We hope you enjoyed our project.